The night of August 3rd, 1888, hung heavy over the small town of Willow Creek, Kentucky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of tobacco leaves carried from the nearby fields. Along Main Street, oil lanterns flickered in front of shuttered stores, their dim glow trembling against the fog that rolled from the hills. It was a quiet night, a kind of quiet that could fool someone into believing that evil couldn't exist here. But behind one house's curtained windows, someone was smiling while the darkness closed in. Thomas Abernathy had always been known for his smile. Not the nervous grin of a man unsure of his place, nor the practiced politeness of a Southern gentleman. His was something else, calm, unwavering, the sort of smile that could unsettle anyone who looked too long. He was a doctor, and in a town like Willow Creek, that made him a man of trust, a man people turned to in fear or sickness. But lately, whispers had begun to crawl through the town like a sickness of their own. Whispers that the good doctor might be something else entirely. The story, as the townsfolk would later tell it, began long before 1888. Long before the bodies. Long before the old well behind his clinic filled with what the sheriff would one day call proof. But for those living in that small Kentucky town, it began with the night young Clara Baines went missing. Clara was 17, a girl known for her laughter, for the lilac ribbon she always wore in her hair, and for her father's strictness. That evening, she was last seen walking past the Abernathy clinic, humming a church hymn under her breath. The sound of her footsteps faded into the fog, followed by the creak of a clinic door. After that, no one saw Clara alive again. By morning, when her parents discovered her bed untouched, they raised the alarm. Sheriff Randall Beck, a man who had more experience finding runaway horses than missing girls, gathered 2 deputies and began searching near the river. The town's preacher offered prayers. The women gathered in doorways, whispering speculation like gossip, disguised as concern. But while most eyes scoured the outskirts of town, no one thought to question the man who stood in front of his clinic every morning, lighting his pipe, a faint smile under his mustache. Thomas kept to his routine that morning. He greeted his patients, prescribed tonics, and treated an old miner with a gash on his hand. His voice was gentle, methodical, never hurried. He moved with the certainty of someone rehearsed, as though every gesture had meaning, every word had weight. But that afternoon, when the sheriff came knocking, Thomas didn't seem surprised. "Morning, doctor," Beck began, tipping his hat. "Have you seen Clara Baines pass through here last night?" Thomas leaned against the doorway, pipe between his fingers. Clara. His gaze lingered for a second too long, as if replaying something in his mind. "I saw her passing on the road. Yes. Looked cheerful enough." "Why? Something happened." Beck hesitated. Even asking questions of Dr. Abernathy felt uncomfortable, like breaking a social rule. "She hasn't come home. We're checking every place she might have gone." Thomas nodded once, his smile tightening. "A small town like ours, Sheriff, it's easy for stories to grow taller than they should. I'm sure she'll turn up. Young girls sometimes need a little space, especially with fathers like hers." That remark unsettled Beck. Still, there wasn't much he could do but nod and leave, tipping his hat again as he went. But after he walked off and Thomas closed the door, a faint humming came from the back room. The same church hymn Clara had been singing the night before. That was the first time someone in Willow Creek disappeared without a trace. It wouldn't be the last. Over the following months, the town lost 2 more people. A farmhand named Eli Turner and a widow, Margaret Duval. Each time, the story replayed like a cruel echo. Someone seen walking through the fog, someone last passing by the doctor's clinic, and then nothing. Sheriff Beck tried to connect the dots, but the evidence was too thin, the coincidences too easy to dismiss. And each time suspicion dared to lean toward Abernathy, he was there, calm, polite, smiling his way through every whispered accusation. What no one knew then was that the doctor kept a book. Not a ledger, not a diary, but a list of names, dates, and quietly coded remarks. It was hidden beneath the false bottom of his desk drawer. The ink was neat, the handwriting elegant, and at the top of every page was a peculiar symbol, a small spiral, carefully drawn. Years later, when the sheriff would finally open that book, he would find a date written in fresh ink beside Clara's name. The date of her death. But before that discovery, before the town would tremble at every knock in the dark, Thomas Abernathy was still their doctor. He still visited patients by horse-drawn carriage, still waved at passing children, still attended Sunday service, where the preacher praised his generosity. And beneath that perfect civility, something inside him stirred, a quiet disgust for their simplicity, their blind trust, their faith. He saw himself as an artist working among fools, a man whose profession gave him license to explore the thin line between life and death. One late evening, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. The handwriting was shaky, smudged with what looked like tears. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. If you want to know where Clara went, search the well behind the doctor's house. Beck hesitated for hours before acting on it. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe fear of being wrong about a man everyone respected. When he finally rode out to the clinic just before dawn, the fog was thick again, settling like a ghost over the ground. Thomas wasn't outside this time. The lanterns along the clinic's porch had all gone dark. Beck tied his horse by the gate and walked quietly around the side of the building. The well stood behind the house, half hidden by weeds and shadow. The air around it smelled wrong, like metal, rot, and something else he couldn't name. When he lifted the cover, the stench hit him first. Then his lantern's light found what looked like the corner of a white ribbon floating on the surface. The sound that left him wasn't a scream, more a broken exhale, something too human to be brave. He turned back toward the house, hand trembling on his revolver. The front door creaked open before he touched it. Inside the clinic, Thomas Abernathy stood waiting, his white coat glowing faintly in the lantern's light. And that same calm smile, unbothered, unbroken, was still there, as if he'd been expecting company all along. "Good morning, Sheriff," Thomas said softly, tilting his head. "You're here earlier than I thought." And that was when Beck realized there had never been madness in the man's eyes, only clarity. By sunrise, Willow Creek had already begun to wake to the whispers. The sheriff's deputy, pale and shaken, had carried the story from the well to the town square before dawn had even settled into light. People gathered in front of the general store, faces pale, hands pressed to their mouths, while others locked their doors and drew their curtains tight. The words the doctor passed from one tongue to another like a curse. But the clinic, standing quiet at the end of Main Street, gave no sign of guilt. The curtains were drawn, the front door closed, and only a faint smell of iodine lingered on the air. When Sheriff Beck returned with a full search party, daylight stripped away the mystery, but not the dread. The men approached the well again, careful, silent. The water, now drained halfway, revealed more than anyone was ready to see. What they found was not just Clara. There were two sets of remains, tangled and discolored by time. Eli Turner's work jacket was still buttoned to his chest. The sheriff didn't speak. He couldn't. The doctor's skill had not spared the dead from decay, only slowed it. They entered the clinic next. Every step across the wooden floor seemed to groan in mourning. The first room was tidy. Medical books lined neatly across shelves, instruments gleaming. The place looked almost too clean, too precise, as if scrubbed by guilt itself. But when Beck reached the rear chamber, the one where the hymn had come from nights before, that order dissolved. Metal trays were overturned. The air was heavy with a copper-like tang. And in the corner, the outline of a trapdoor lay beneath a stained rug. Beck kneeled, pulling it aside with deliberate care. The smell that rose from below was the same one he'd found at the well, stronger now, closer. He motioned to his deputy. Together, they lifted the panel. Beneath it, a narrow crawl space. Damp earth. A few wooden boxes. In one, preserved jars. Inside those jars, what looked like pieces of anatomy. Human, carefully labeled in neat cursive ink. There were heart valves, strands of hair, small fingertips. 13 jars in all. The sheriff stumbled back, covering his mouth, but forced himself to look again. Each jar bore the same mark that matched the pages of Abernathy's secret book, the spiral. Slowly, Beck turned to his men. "Seal this place," he said hoarsely. "No one in or out until I say." But the doctor was gone. By the time the men fanned out through Willow Creek, Thomas Abernathy had disappeared into the fields north of town. His horse was missing from the stable, and a week's worth of medical supplies was gone from the shelves. For the next 2 days, searches were organized across 3 counties. Bloodhounds followed his scent through the hills, but rain came hard that second night, washing away tracks and hope alike. The newspapers came soon after. Louisville reporters arrived by train, scribbling furiously while photographing the well and the clinic. They called him the Smiling Doctor. Some claimed he was performing experiments. Others speculated insanity brought on by mercury exposure or grief. But those who had known him, the preacher, the townsfolk, even Beck, spoke softly, uncertain whether they'd ever truly known the man at all. Their doctor, the one who birthed their children and buried their dead, had vanished into the wilderness like something born of it. Weeks passed, then months. No trace. But on the last week of November, a farmer from the outskirts of Madison County rode into town with a story. He'd found a man lying half dead near the edge of his property, clothes bloodied, face pale. When asked his name, the stranger had whispered, "Abernathy," before fainting again. The sheriff didn't hesitate. By the time Beck arrived, the fugitive was awake, sitting upright in a dim barn, hands bound, that same small smile resting faintly under his mustache. "You've caused quite a stir, Doctor," Beck said quietly, stepping forward. The barn smelled of damp straw and iron. "Anything you'd like to tell me before we take you back?" Thomas lifted his eyes, calm as ever. "There's nothing to tell," he replied. "Everything I've done was meant to understand life better. Wouldn't you agree that progress demands sacrifice?" Beck stared, speechless. Abernathy's tone was not one of madness. It was conviction, almost offended that others couldn't see his reasoning. Finally, the sheriff muttered, "You'll have your chance to explain before a judge." Abernathy chuckled softly. "A judge," he said, leaning back. "I'm afraid men like you don't understand the same language I speak in." As Beck led him out into the cold morning, a light rain began to fall again. For the first time, the doctor looked up toward the gray sky and whispered, "She'll never sing again." When Beck turned sharply, demanding what he met only silence. That smile remained. Back in Willow Creek, the town's mood was split between relief and dread. Mothers clutched their children tighter, and the preacher's sermons swelled with righteous fury. They wanted closure, proof that evil could be captured, chained, dealt with. But deep down, many couldn't let go of the image of a kind doctor with gentle hands and polite words. Evil, they realized, didn't always shout. Sometimes it smiled. That night, as Abernathy sat alone in the county jail, damp straw beneath him, he hummed once again. The hymn echoed through the narrow stone halls, faint but distinct, the same melody Clara had sung before her death. Down the corridor, a jailer paused mid-step, unsettled by that sound, unsure why it made the air seem colder. Above the jail, the wind howled across the Kentucky hills. Somewhere in the darkness, a lantern swayed outside the courthouse window, casting its trembling light on the face of a man who had finally stopped pretending. Winter settled quickly over Kentucky that year. The frost came earlier than usual, covering fields and rooftops in dull silver, as if nature itself tried to cleanse the land of what had stained it. In the courthouse of Willow Creek, the people gathered long before dawn, wrapped in coats and grief, each one desperate to see the monster the papers called the Doctor Who Smiled. By the time the clock struck 9, the room was packed to the walls with faces, some angry, some weeping, some simply curious. Thomas Abernathy entered without resistance, escorted by 2 deputies. His wrists were shackled, yet he carried himself like a guest at his own reception. The usual crisp white coat was gone, replaced by a plain gray suit, but that familiar composure remained, the cool eyes, the faint curl of the lips. The crowd's murmur swelled when he looked up, scanning the room slowly, calmly. When he spotted Sheriff Beck among them, he nodded politely, as if greeting an old acquaintance. The judge, a heavy man named Aloysius Crane, adjusted his glasses and tapped the gavel once. "This court is now in session for the case of the Commonwealth versus Dr. Thomas Abernathy," he announced. Charges: multiple counts of murder, concealment, and desecration. Gasps rippled through the rows of benches. Abernathy didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands in front of him and listened, attentive, almost scholarly, as the prosecution began to recount the crimes. The evidence was laid out methodically: photographs of the well, the preserved specimens, the book with the spiral marks. Each piece felt heavier than the last. But with every accusation, that faint smile of his returned, as if he were quietly amused by how little they truly understood. The prosecutor, young and fiercely determined, moved closer to the dock. "Dr. Abernathy," he said, voice sharp, "do you deny that these items found in your possession belong to the victims?" Thomas leaned slightly forward. "Belong," he said softly. "No, sir, they do not belong to them anymore. They were remnants. Material for study. You speak as if they were trophies, when in truth they were notes. Records of the human mechanism." The courtroom erupted with outrage. Women gasped, men shouted. The judge slammed his gavel down repeatedly until silence returned, though not peace. Beck, sitting quietly near the back, watched the man speak, and for the first time he saw something new in Abernathy's expression. It wasn't insanity. It wasn't guilt. It was admiration for himself, for his work. He truly believed every word he said. The prosecutor pressed on. "And Clara Baines, doctor? The young woman whose ribbon we found in your well. Was she your study too?" Abernathy's smile faltered only briefly. He looked downward, then said, "Clara was not supposed to die. She was spirited, curious. She asked questions. Few people do. But curiosity, as you see, is dangerous." The silence that followed hung heavy. The judge cleared his throat, voice low and tired. "You speak of human lives as though they were curiosities, Dr. Abernathy. Do you feel no remorse?" Thomas met his gaze evenly. Remorse is a sentiment for those who act without purpose. Outside, the winter wind howled against the windows. In that brittle sound, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Every person could feel it, the creeping realization that they were not witnessing a man defending himself, but one revealing what he had always been. Over the next days, testimonies were read, exhibits presented, and witnesses heard. The deputy spoke of the well, the jars, the trapdoor. The farmer described finding Abernathy nearly unconscious, whispering strange phrases about life and perfection. Even Sheriff Beck was called to the stand, his voice steady as he recounted that night, the smell, the hymn, the smile that refused to fade. Only once did Abernathy interrupt. "Sheriff," he said mid-testimony, "you remember how calm I was when you found me, don't you? There was no rebellion, no madness. Ask yourself why." He smiled faintly. "Because I knew it was finished. My work. My discovery." Beck gritted his teeth, refusing to respond. When final arguments were delivered, Judge Crane's expression had turned into something close to pity. "Dr. Abernathy," he said slowly, "men greater than you have struggled with the mysteries of creation and left them in God's hands. You took them in your own." Thomas simply nodded. "And God," he replied, "had his chance." The sentence came swiftly, death by hanging. The verdict drew a mix of applause and tears from the crowd. Yet as Abernathy was led away, there was no fight in him, no resistance. He turned once more toward the gallery, eyes scanning the sea of faces he had fooled for years. His gaze paused briefly on the sheriff. "Do not bury truth with me, Sheriff Beck," he said softly. "In time, you'll see that curiosity never dies. It only changes hands." The next morning, the snow began to fall, quietly, slowly, as if the heavens themselves sought to muffle the end. Thomas Abernathy was hanged at dawn behind the courthouse, his final expression still faintly twisted into that same knowing smile. The town did not rejoice. They closed their doors, swept their porches, tried to let silence fill what horror had left behind. Yet weeks later, when workers cleaned the clinic for its sale, they found a letter hidden inside the desk drawer, marked by the same spiral. It read only, "The experiment was never mine alone." And with that, the legend of the smiling doctor became something more than crime. It became a question that haunted Willow Creek long after the hangman's rope had turned to dust. Spring arrived late to Willow Creek in 1889, as if the earth itself was reluctant to bloom after such darkness. The clinic stood empty for months, its windows boarded, weeds creeping up its sides like accusations. No buyer came forward. Who would want to own a place where evil had worn a doctor's coat? Yet as the seasons turned, the town began to breathe again. Children played in the streets, merchants reopened their doors with confidence, and Sunday sermons returned to salvation rather than damnation. But Sheriff Beck couldn't forget the letter. The words haunted him during sleepless nights. The experiment was never mine alone. He'd read it dozens of times, studied the handwriting, examined the paper. The spiral symbol at the bottom was identical to those found in Abernathy's hidden book. Yet something about the phrasing felt different, more urgent, more personal, as if it were written not as a confession, but as a warning. 3 weeks after the hanging, Beck made a decision that would change everything. He gathered the evidence boxes from the courthouse basement and spread them across his kitchen table. The photographs, the jars, the book with its meticulous entries. He studied each name, each date, looking for patterns he might have missed during the investigation. Clara Baines, Eli Turner, Margaret Duval, all local residents, all last seen near the clinic. But as he flipped through Abernathy's records more carefully, something new emerged. There were other names. Names he didn't recognize. William Hartley, October 1887. One entry read. Sarah Mitchell, December 1887. Beck had never heard these names mentioned during the trial, never seen them on any missing persons reports. He counted carefully. 13 names total, but only 3 bodies had been found in the well. Where were the others? The next morning, Beck rode out to the county records office in Louisville. The clerk, a thin man with wire spectacles, searched through birth and death certificates while Beck waited. When he returned, his face was pale. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I found records for William Hartley and Sarah Mitchell. Both died of natural causes according to their death certificates. Both were patients of Dr. Abernathy." Beck's blood ran cold. Natural causes? Hartley died of heart failure. Mitchell of consumption. Both signed off by the attending physician, Thomas Abernathy himself. The ride back to Willow Creek felt longer than usual. Beck's mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. If Abernathy had been killing patients and signing their death certificates, how many others were there? How long had this been going on? And most disturbing of all, if the experiment was never his alone, who else was involved? That evening, Beck visited the town's undertaker, Marcus Grimm. The old man lived above his funeral parlor, surrounded by the smell of embalming fluid and prayer books. When Beck showed him the list of names, Grimm's weathered face grew troubled. "I remember most of these," he said slowly. "Simple burials, nothing unusual. Families grieved, paid their respects, moved on." He paused, studying the paper more carefully. "But Sheriff, there's something strange. 3 of these folks, Hartley, Mitchell, and this Mary Preston here, they were all buried in pine boxes. Closed caskets. Families said the doctor advised against viewing the bodies due to disfigurement from their illnesses." Beck felt his stomach turn. "Did you ever see the bodies yourself?" Grimm shook his head. Doctor's orders were always followed without question. He was persuasive, professional. If he said a body wasn't fit for viewing, we trusted his medical judgment. "I need those graves opened," Beck said quietly. The exhumations began 3 days later, just after dawn. Beck had recruited men from neighboring counties to avoid gossip spreading through Willow Creek before they knew what they were dealing with. The first coffin, William Hartley's, was raised from the cold earth with painful care. When the lid was pried open, the men gathered around it fell silent. The coffin was empty except for a collection of river stones and a small piece of paper. On it, written in Abernathy's precise handwriting, was a single word: relocated. Sarah Mitchell's grave told the same story. Empty coffin, river stones, the same cryptic note. By the time they reached the 3rd grave, Beck's hands were trembling. Mary Preston's coffin was different, heavier. Inside, they found not stones, but medical instruments. Scalpels, bone saws, and glass vials. At the bottom, another note: the work continues elsewhere. That night, Beck sat alone in his office, staring at the evidence spread before him. The horrible truth was becoming clear. Abernathy had been using his position as town doctor to select victims, forge death certificates, and supply bodies to someone else. Someone who shared his twisted curiosity about human anatomy. The clinic had been just one part of a larger operation. He pulled out the original letter again. The experiment was never mine alone. Now he understood. Thomas Abernathy hadn't been a lone monster. He'd been a supplier. Somewhere out there, his partner was still conducting experiments, still collecting specimens, still smiling while innocents died. Beck walked to the window and looked out at the quiet streets of Willow Creek. The lanterns flickered peacefully in the evening mist, casting the same gentle glow they had the night Clara Baines disappeared. But now he knew the truth. Evil hadn't ended with the hangman's rope. It had simply learned to hide better. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the hills, mournful, lonely, carrying secrets toward destinations unknown. Beck realized his investigation was far from over. Somewhere along those railroad tracks, in another town, with another trusted doctor, the real horror was just beginning. The letter had been right. The experiment was never Abernathy's alone. And it was still happening. Summer brought no warmth to Sheriff Beck's conscience. The discovery of the empty coffins had spread through Willow Creek like a slow infection. The townspeople whispered of curses, of the doctor's ghost, of unfinished sins buried beneath the soil. Beck, however, faced something colder than superstition. The realization that his investigation was far from complete. Someone had been helping Abernathy. Someone clever enough to vanish from suspicion. He began retracing old records, tracing every supply order, every financial ledger, every letter received by the doctor over the years. In a dusty file at the post office, he found what he'd been looking for: a set of correspondence receipts. Dozens of packages shipped to Louisville, always addressed to the same contact, Dr. Silas W. Mather, surgeon at Street Selene's Infirmary. The name rang faintly familiar. Mather had been mentioned during the trial, only in passing, when the prosecutor referenced Abernathy's medical training in the city. They'd studied together, even published a small piece in a medical journal on postmortem nerve activity. No one had thought twice about it then. But Beck saw it now for what it was: a thread leading directly out of the grave. 2 days later, he boarded the dawn train to Louisville, leaving Willow Creek shrouded in mist behind him. The city rose from the horizon like a promise of progress. Gas lamps, narrow alleys, horse-drawn trolleys bustling with doctors, lawyers, and factory workers. But underneath that pulse of modern life lingered the same sickness, the same human darkness that no amount of light could wash away. St. Selene's Infirmary sat on the edge of the city, all red brick and iron gates. The sign above the entrance had faded with time, its paint peeling like an old scar. Beck showed his badge to the porter and asked to see Dr. Mather. Within minutes, he was guided through sterile hallways to a narrow office lined with anatomical sketches. Mather himself stood by the window, tall and lean, his face pale and his spectacles catching the light. He turned slowly when Beck entered. "Sheriff Beck of Willow Creek," he said calmly. "To what do I owe the visit of a lawman from so far away?" Beck studied him carefully. There was restraint in Mather's tone, the same controlled calm Abernathy once had. "I think you already know why I'm here," Beck said. "Thomas Abernathy. He worked with you, didn't he?" A smirk touched Mather's lips. "Worked is a generous word. He was my student once. Eager. Too eager, perhaps. He sent you packages." The doctor raised a brow. "Medical samples? Yes. All properly documented. All declared through university channels." "Why?" Beck laid the letter on the desk, the final note recovered from Abernathy's clinic. "Because your friend didn't just study corpses. He created them. And this," he pointed to the spiral drawn in ink, "matches the mark found in every one of his records." Mather's eyes flickered. Not surprise, recognition. He turned away, pacing toward a tall cabinet. "I warned him," he murmured. "Thomas was reckless." I told him that the line between study and obsession was too thin for fools to walk. What line are we talking about? Beck demanded. Mather opened the cabinet and withdrew a sealed glass jar. Inside, suspended in clear liquid, floated what looked like a piece of human tissue, thin, pale, almost translucent. Regeneration, Mather said softly. We believed the human body could be coaxed into recreating its own damaged parts. Abernathy saw death as a doorway to understanding that process. Beck's stomach turned. You're telling me he killed people to prove it? Mather's gaze met his. He volunteered to experiment first on the dying, the hopeless cases. Then something changed. He thought the transformation required purity, raw vitality. So he killed the living. Yes, Mather said after a pause. And that's when I broke from him. But he kept sending letters, always talking about a breakthrough, about his next subject. Beck stared, unmoved. You knew what he was doing. You could have stopped it. Mather exhaled slowly. And what would I have said to the university board? That a colleague was murdering patients in the name of science? They would have called me mad and dismissed us both. And yet, he said, voice tightening, without his data, none of our discoveries would exist. So tell me, Sheriff, who's guiltier? The man who kills or the world that rewards the results? Beck slammed his hand on the desk. Don't twist this, Doctor. You and Abernathy crossed a line no man should cross. He's dead now. Maybe it's time you join him. Mather smiled faintly, the kind of smile Beck had learned to fear. Oh, Sheriff, do you really think it ended with him? The project lives on, just not here. Before Beck could speak again, the doctor pressed a button beneath the desk. A shrill alarm echoed through the hallway. The porter from outside burst in, shouting. Mather stepped back toward a rear door, his face calm, his movements practiced. You should go, he said. You have no jurisdiction here. By the time Beck reached the door, the man had vanished into the infirmary's lower corridors. The sheriff searched frantically, moving through cold rooms filled with surgical tools, rows of empty beds, and the echo of dripping water. He found nothing but dust and silence. Hours later, he reported Mather's disappearance to local authorities, but they dismissed his warnings as the ramblings of a small-town sheriff chasing ghosts from another man's crimes. Beck returned to Willow Creek defeated, his mind turning over the doctor's final words. Asterisk, the project lives on. Asterisk. That night, as he sat on his porch beneath the soundless stars, the wind carried the faint hum of a locomotive passing through the hills. And in that mechanical rhythm, Beck heard something too deliberate to be coincidence, a humming, low and patient, the same tune Clara once sang. Somewhere out there, someone else was smiling in the dark. By early autumn, the rhythm of the train had become part of Willow Creek's nights. To most, it was just a freight line that passed through twice a week, carrying timber and tobacco toward Louisville. But to Sheriff Beck, that low whistle in the distance was something else, an echo, a warning he couldn't shake. After his visit to St. Celine's and Dr. Mather's sudden disappearance, Beck had grown restless. The authorities in Louisville dismissed him, calling his claims unsubstantiated and paranoid. But he knew better. Too many threads led back to those rail lines, shipments, correspondence, the unexplained crates ordered under Abernathy's name years before. Mather had fled somewhere along that same route. Late one night, under the dying glow of a kerosene lamp, Beck spread out the train schedules over his desk. There was one destination that appeared too often in the manifests, a place called Cross Hollow Station, a small freight junction barely marked on the map. According to the records, several shipments from Abernathy's clinic and the infirmary had been routed there over the past 5 years. Most were labeled medical equipment or preservation supplies. None had ever been logged as received. Beck decided he'd had enough of waiting. Before dawn, he saddled his horse and set off along the tracks. The air was bitterly cold, the sky the gray-blue shade that comes before sunrise. Birds stirred in the pines, the world otherwise silent, but for the rhythmic clatter of his horse's hooves over the earth. Cross Hollow Station appeared mid-morning, little more than a platform, a storage shed, and a telegraph office standing in quiet disrepair. The depot seemed abandoned at first glance. But when Beck dismounted, he noticed faint footprints in the mud near the side door, fresh and deliberate. Inside the storage shed, the air was stale, carrying the faint bite of disinfectant and something darker beneath it. Rows of wooden crates lined the walls, most covered in dust. A few had broken seals, marked with the same spiral symbol found in Abernathy's notes. Beck's fingers hovered over one before prying it open. The stench hit him first. Inside, rather than instruments or books, lay glass jars filled with preserved organs, carefully labeled with dates spanning several years. Each jar bore Abernathy's handwriting, but mixed among them were newer samples, labels written in a different, sharper hand. One read simply, M. Prescott, August 1889, Phase 4. Beck's jaw tightened. Prescott had been the name of a patient buried in Louisville that spring. He turned at the sound of a creaking floorboard behind him. From the shadows stepped a man, gray coat, gloved hands, a slim walking cane. The figure's face was half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Sheriff Beck," the man said calmly. "You made good time." Beck's hand moved to his revolver. "Dr. Mather, I assume." The man smiled faintly. "Titles are formality out here. But yes, we've met, though not formally." "What is this place?" Beck demanded, motioning toward the crates. "Your laboratory? Your graveyard." Mather walked forward, tapping the cane gently against the wooden planks. "A continuation," he said. Thomas lacked restraint. His work was crude, emotional. But his findings were real. "I couldn't let it die with him." "He murdered innocent people." "Sacrificed," Mather corrected, his tone chillingly even. "Each of them taught us more about regeneration, about potential. We've already achieved partial results. Soon, perhaps, we'll erase death entirely." Beck's voice hardened. "You sound just like him." "I sound like progress," Mather replied. "The kind you can't hang or burn. It survives, even in places like this." He moved closer, reaching for a small switch box near the far wall. With a click, dim electric bulbs flickered to life overhead. Primitive, but functional. What they illuminated froze Beck where he stood. Along the back wall stood 3 iron containers the size of coffins. Each had tubing and gauges running from their sides, humming faintly. Inside the frosted glass windows, shapes floated, human or nearly so. One twitched as if stirring from sleep. Mather's eyes gleamed. "Abernathy thought perfection began after death. I realized it starts before. These subjects, volunteers if you prefer, are in the second phase. Soon their cells will adapt. Life will restart itself." Beck drew his revolver, his hand unsteady. "You're insane." Mather tilted his head. "No, Sheriff. I'm inevitable." Beck fired once, hitting the switch box. Sparks erupted, lights dying instantly. The shed was thrown into darkness, broken only by the lantern beam twisting across the floor. Beck ran toward the door as machinery hissed behind him. A burst of steam blinded his path. He turned, weapon raised, but the space where Mather had stood was empty. One of the iron containers cracked open with a metallic groan. Thick liquid spilled onto the floor, followed by something that hit the wood with a wet thud. Beck took a step closer and froze. It was a human form, pallid and trembling, its features still forming beneath translucent skin. He backed away, choking on the stench. Then, from somewhere deeper in the shadows, Mather's voice echoed faintly. "You can't kill evolution, Sheriff. It continues with or without consent." Beck stumbled out into the daylight, gasping for air. The station sat silent again, the wind tugging at his coat. No one followed. But as he mounted his horse, he saw light flicker once more through the cracks in the shed wall. Someone still moving inside. He rode hard back toward Willow Creek, the rhythmic sound of hooves keeping time with the fading whistle of a distant train. Behind him, the world he thought he'd cleansed shuddered awake once more. Somewhere in that shed, beneath the dim electric glow, the second phase of Abernathy's legacy began to stir. Sheriff Beck returned to Willow Creek just before nightfall, the horizon cut by bruised clouds and the echo of thunder rolling through the hills. His horse, slick with sweat, stumbled as if sharing its rider's exhaustion. Beck had seen many horrors in his life, accidents, violence, war, but nothing like what lay inside that station shed. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he'd witnessed science, madness, or something too cruel to name. He walked through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, hat low, eyes downward. The townsfolk greeted him with nods but said little. To them, the nightmare had ended a year ago. They buried the past in silence, pretending it was gone. But Beck knew better. The spiral still haunted his thoughts, burned behind his eyelids when he closed them. That night, he sat alone in his office. The rain outside fell hard against the windows, blurring the lamplight into streaks of gold. He poured himself bourbon, but the bottle did little to slow the racing in his chest. On the desk lay the jar he'd taken from Cross Hollow, a single glass sample, labeled only Phase 2. Inside floated something that might once have been human. Its skin shimmered faintly under the light, veins like silver threads beneath the surface. He lifted the jar and held it close, studying the label again. M. Abernathy, 1889. Beck froze. The initials stood for Margaret, the late wife of Thomas Abernathy. He remembered her funeral, years before the murders, when the doctor stood at her graveside, silent, unmoving, his hand resting on the coffin as the preacher spoke. No one in Willow Creek had questioned his grief. No one imagined that grief might harden into obsession. Beck tilted the jar gently. Whatever floated inside had her shape, female, about the same size. He set it back down carefully, as if the motion itself could wake what rested within. There was no doubt anymore. Thomas Abernathy hadn't snapped overnight. He'd started the experiments with his wife, trying to conquer death itself. And Mather had simply continued where his friend had failed. The sheriff reached for his notebook and began writing. Every detail of Cross Hollow, every name, every face. He didn't know if anyone would ever believe it, but it had to be recorded. But before he could finish, a knock sounded on the door. It was past midnight. He hesitated, the revolver heavy in his hand as he opened the door. Standing in the rain was Joseph Carter, the telegraph operator. The young man's face was pale, his hands shaking. "Sheriff," he stammered, "we just got a message. Came from the Louisville line. You should see it." Beck followed him to the small station house, boots crunching over wet gravel. Inside, the telegraph keys still clattered faintly, copper wires humming in a storm. Carter pointed toward a slip of paper resting on the counter, the ink still damp. It read, "Shipment delayed. Arrival rescheduled. Cross Hollow, Phase 3. Beck's stomach dropped. "When did this come through?" 10 minutes ago, Carter said. "But sir, the Louisville operator swears no one sent it. He checked his line. It came from our end." The rain grew louder, the thunder closer. Beck scanned the message again. If Mather was still alive, if that facility still operated, then Cross Hollow wasn't just a hiding place, it was expanding. "Get word to the station master," Beck said sharply. "Lock down every freight line heading out of town." But even as he spoke, a sound cut through the rain, the distant, low whistle of a train. Beck turned toward the window. Through the darkness, a single light approached from the valley, flickering between the trees like an omen. "No," Beck whispered. "That line's been closed for months." He pushed past Carter, grabbing his coat and hat. The telegraph operator shouted after him, but Beck was already outside, running toward the tracks. The rain drenched him instantly, mud splattering across his boots. The noise grew louder, the screech of wheels, the rumble of a slowing engine. Steam rolled across the landscape, filling the night with ghostly fog. The locomotive came into view, black metal, unmarked, pulling 5 freight cars. No banners, no markings, nothing to signal its origin. As it rolled to a stop, Beck saw movement near the rear, a figure stepping down from the caboose, umbrella in hand. Even in the downpour, he recognized the calm posture, the deliberate poise. Dr. Mather. He stood in the rain as if it didn't touch him, one gloved hand resting on the rail. "You came fast, Sheriff," he said. "I thought you might. That's why I came back." Beck raised his revolver. "This ends tonight." Mather smiled, faintly lit by the train's headlamp. "You said the same thing about Abernathy. And yet here we are." He stepped closer, voice low and steady. You can't stop what's already begun. This train carries the final stage. Cells that survived degradation. Flesh that remembers how to live. Something inside the nearest freight car shifted, metal rattling, chain straining. Beck's grip tightened. "Open it," Mather said softly. "See the future, Sheriff. See what he died for." Before Beck could answer, the door slid open on its own. A figure stumbled out, coughing, naked, drenched in fluid that glistened like oil. Its eyes fluttered open, empty, glassy, then focused. And for a brief, unbearable moment, Beck saw Clara Baines staring back at him. He staggered back, revolver shaking in his hand. "No, that's not possible." Mather's voice was barely a whisper. "Thomas perfected her before he died. I merely brought her back." Beck fired. Once, twice, 3 times. Mather fell backward, the umbrella collapsing beside him. The girl, whatever she was, didn't move. The shots had silenced everything except the rain. When dawn arrived, there was no train on the tracks. No body. No girl. Only muddy footprints leading into the woods, and a faint spiral carved into the earth. Beck stood there until the sun burned away the fog. For the second time, Willow Creek believed the nightmare was over. And for the second time, it wasn't. The winter that followed was the coldest in Willow Creek's memory. The trees cracked in the night from frost, and the river carried ice all the way from the mountains. Most folks took it as a sign that the world was trying to close its wounds, to freeze and forget. Sheriff Beck knew better. His sleep was restless, haunted by the sound of a train that no longer ran and the face of a girl that should never have opened her eyes. He'd searched every yard of track for weeks after that night, rode as far as Cross Hollow and back, questioned every station master between counties, but found nothing. No train, no crates, no Dr. Silas Mather. Just silence, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Still, one thing gave him pause. At the edge of the woods near Willow Creek, he found a trail leading west, a faint path marked by burned grass in the shape of a spiral. He covered it with rocks, pretending not to see it again. But sometimes, when the wind howled from that direction, he swore he could still smell the chemicals from that storage shed. Faint but unmistakable. By January, Beck had grown haggard. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his right hand shook when he wrote his reports. The townsfolk treated him kindly, but with distance. They knew obsession when they saw it. Even the preacher avoided mentioning Abernathy's name in sermons. The town chose peace through forgetfulness. Beck chose truth through torment. Then, one freezing night, a letter arrived. It was slipped under the sheriff's door without a knock. The envelope bore no stamp, only a single inked spiral on its face. Inside, written in a cold, steady hand, was this: Asterisk, Thomas was the beginning. You are the continuation. Meet me at the clinic. Midnight. Asterisk. Beck read it twice, his breath clouding the air. Whoever wrote it knew, and they wanted him to come willingly. At exactly midnight, he arrived at the old clinic. The place stood abandoned since Abernathy's arrest, weathered and skeletal, its windows black with grime. He pushed open the door and stepped into the dark. Floorboards creaked like strained voices underfoot. The smell, dust, age, and faint antiseptic was enough to turn his stomach. A lantern flickered near the examination table. Beck's hand moved to his revolver. "Mather," he called. A voice answered, calm and far too familiar. "You always did arrive early, Sheriff." Mather emerged from the shadows dressed in black, thinner now, his face drawn but his eyes alive with feverish light. "I told you the work would continue. Did you really think bullets could end it?" Beck steadied the gun. "I saw you fall." "You saw what I wanted you to see," Mather said. He stepped closer to the lantern, revealing a bandaged arm, pale against the firelight. "You can't kill an idea, Sheriff. You can only transform it, just as I transformed her." He gestured toward the adjoining room. Beck hesitated, then followed, revolver raised. Inside, rows of jars lined the shelves again, each glowing faintly under the light. But these were different, newer, cleaner, alive. Within them were things that pulsed faintly, responding to sound. And in the center of the room, lying on a steel table, was Clara Baines. Her eyes were open, watching. Her breathing shallow. Beck froze, mind spinning between disbelief and dread. How? She's not dead, Mather said softly. Never was, not truly. Abernathy found the process. I perfected it. Cells that refuse to decay. Flesh that adapts. She is proof that the human body does not end, it evolves. Beck's stomach turned. She's not human. Mather smiled slightly. And yet she dreams. She remembers you, Sheriff. She whispered your name in her sleep. Beck stepped closer, eyes fixed on the girl. Her lips moved faintly, forming a single word he couldn't hear. Then her hand twitched, reaching toward him. Help. The sound came out cracked and weak, but it was her voice. Beck's revolver lowered, trembling in his grasp. For a heartbeat, he saw her as she'd once been, a girl humming on the road, laughing in sunlight. That memory cut deeper than any horror in front of him. She died, Mather, Beck said, voice breaking. Let her rest. Mather tilted his head. Rest? You think death is peace? It's waste. Decay. I've given her humanity, its first chance at permanence. His hand moved too quickly. Beck reacted by instinct. The gun roared twice. Mather stumbled back, blood blooming across his chest, but laughter still spilling from his lips. You can't stop it, he gasped. It's in her now, it's in you. Beck fired a final shot. The scientist collapsed against the metal tray, silent. For a long moment, the only sound came from the flickering lantern and the soft rhythm of Clara's breathing. Then, slowly, even that faded. He stood alone in the dark, the revolver shaking in his hand. Then he reached for the nearest jar and smashed it to the ground. The next followed, and the next, until the floor was slick with fluid and shattered glass. Flames leapt when the lantern fell, hungry, quick. Within minutes, the clinic was burning, the light rising through the night like an ending and a confession. By dawn, nothing remained but ash and the faint smell of chemicals drifting through the smoke. Beck never spoke of that night. He resigned a month later, leaving Willow Creek without a word. Some say he moved west. Others claimed he was found years later, feverish and dying in a border town hospital, mumbling a single phrase. Asterisk, the girl smiled. Asterisk. No one ever reopened the clinic. But on quiet nights, when the wind is right, those who live near the old ruins swear they hear faint humming coming from beneath the earth, a melody that sounds very much like a young woman's hymn.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.